President Trump has done the unthinkable. He pulled the troops out of northeastern Syria, and as a result, thousands of terrorists, jihadists, and mercenaries invaded Syria ahead of the Turkish army. They're slaughtering and even beheading dozens of civilians, including the Kurds that Trump abandoned.
They are sending in Arab militias controlled by Turkey. Turkey is also using Arab militias as shock troops.
Arab militias filled with jihadists, former fighters from ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
The Washington establishment is outraged at Trump.
It has been the most shameful thing that any president has done in modern history in terms of foreign policy.
I can think of nothing more disgusting in all the years I've been in Congress than what this president is allowing to happen with the Kurds.
But it wasn't long ago that those Arab militias filled with Al-Qaeda and ISIS fighters were the darlings of Washington. Back then, they were known as peace-loving, democratic alternative to Assad the dictator, the Free Syrian Army, or moderate opposition.
In March of this year, I introduced a bipartisan bill that would authorize the president to arm fully vetted members of the moderate Syrian opposition.
Corporate media and politicians were in lockstep branding them moderate rebels.
The United States and Turkey have struck a deal to train and equip moderate Syrian rebels.
The training will take place in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. The goal is to train these moderate rebels and send them back to Syria.
Arm and train moderate Syrian rebels.
Moderate rebels.
These heartthrob moderate rebels got weapons from the CIA in a secret $1 billion per year train and equip program called Timber Sycamore, and in a separate parallel program run by the Pentagon. In fact, 21 of the 28 militias invading northeastern Syria were armed by the US. The pundits and think tanks here in Washington, they were on board. Arm the moderate rebels.
I wanted the United States to provide arms to the Syrian rebels, the moderate rebels.
I think we should have been arming these rebel groups early on.
Time and time again, there has been an opportunity to boost these rebels.
Back then, it was an open secret in Washington that those Free Syrian Army rebels were beheading people and sometimes fighting alongside Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But it wasn't a big deal because I guess they were doing it moderately. In fact, the US Army's West Point Academy published an analysis back in 2013 saying the Free Syrian Army has always been more of a brand name than an actual organization. One pro-opposition analyst put it like this: as for the moderate rebel force, for the last several years, much of America's support has gone to Free Syrian Army factions that have functioned as battlefield auxiliaries and weapons farms for larger Islamist and jihadist factions, including Syria's Al-Qaeda affiliate. In other words, the moderate rebel FSA brand was effectively a way for Washington to launder weapons to Al-Qaeda without generating controversy over its unseemly past. Even as Eliot Engel publicly admitted the weapons were going to jihadists, he continued to support it.
I was a supporter of aiding the rebels. I still am a supporter in aiding the rebels when it was General Idris and the Free Syrian Army. Unfortunately, what's happened in Syria is it's gotten murky, and you've had jihadists rushing in from all over the Middle East, and so now if we clandestinely or not so clandestinely send weapons, and we are helping to do that, we want to make sure that those weapons get into the right hands and not into the wrong hands.
No surprise, Hillary Clinton took a shot at Trump too. She wrote on Twitter that this sickening horror is one man's fault. But back in 2012, Hillary Clinton thought that kind of sickening horror was a great way to get Assad to negotiate. A leaked document showed that Clinton's State Department knew that jihadists were the major forces driving the insurgency, and that the US and its allies supported the establishment of a Salafist principality, or Islamic State in eastern Syria, that they thought would force Assad to the table. Turns out they were wrong, and hundreds of thousands of innocent people were killed. But hey, that's why pencils have erasers, right? Now there are some people who took it a step further. Vice Media's Molly Crabapple is a fellow at the State Department and US military-funded New America Foundation. In 2014, she embedded with the Islamic Front, a collection of Islamist militias led by the Turkey-backed Ahrar al-Sham and the Saudi-backed Army of Islam. MSNBC's Chris Hayes had her on to talk about the trip.
The last story you wrote about your last trip to the Syrian-Turkish border with two fighters. What group were they from?
They were from the Islamic Front.
Where does the Islamic Front lie in the spectrum of bad rebels and, quote, moderate opposition?
The term moderate rebel is first, meaningless, and second, Islamophobic.
As Amnesty International documented, Ahrar al-Sham abducted children and religious minorities and destroyed churches. And moderate rebel is the term the CIA uses to certify extremist groups kosher to receive weapons and training. Then it's repurposed to whitewash those fanatics for Western media. And what's Islamophobic is to act like extremists represent all Muslims, just like conflating Zionism with Judaism is anti-Semitic.
There are all sorts of groups of varying degrees of religiosity or of secularism, but I think what's important is not how long their beards are. What's important is whether they respect human rights and whether or not they've committed war crimes.
Putting Islamic Front and human rights in the same sentence is like saying Donald Trump and healthy lifestyle together. Now, Crabapple is infuriated that the same Turkish government that trained and armed these fanatics is slaughtering Kurds, as if that extremism just developed overnight. Others didn't even bother with the whole moderate opposition or Islamists for human rights charade. Credit where credit is due, they were honest. They promoted the jihadists and directly called to arm them. Former CIA agent Clint Watts called Ahrar al-Sham an al-Qaeda-linked group worth befriending. Michael Weiss and Roy Gutman called jihadists in Aleppo heroes. Think tank fellow Charles Lister said this in the US Capitol building.
Al-Qaeda has really got it right, I hate to say.
Or how about this tweet from a CIA agent saying his job was to convince Al-Qaeda members to work with US intelligence. That's not a one-off. Former CIA director David Petraeus, who was the driving force to convince Obama to arm the moderate rebels, he later called to directly arm Al-Qaeda. So what's the difference between the moderate rebels of 2013 and today's jihadists slaughtering Kurds in Syria? Back then, they were attacking the officially designated enemy of Washington, the Syrian regime. While US politicians and war propagandists are shedding crocodile tears for the Syrian Kurds being killed by the jihadists they armed to the teeth, Syrian Kurds themselves are telling a different story.
Thank God for the return of army. Thank God for the return of the Syrian Arab army.